So this year, being the bicentenary of Wallace's birth, we are hosting 2 Linnean Lens focusing on Alfred Russel Wallace's manuscripts that are in our collections. And I should say before I forget that these manuscripts have been digitized and they're freely available to consult on our website. And we can put a link to that during the talk, so keep an eye on the chat. So in this first one, we or Sandy Knapp, who I'll introduce in a minute, will focus on Wallace in the Amazon. And the second one, which I believe is on the 14th of March, will be led by George Beccoloni and will be on the manuscripts from the Malay archipelago. Before I introduce our speaker today, just a few words of housekeeping. Namely that if you want to ask a question, please do so. We'll have time for questions at the end, but please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen rather than the chat, because I won't be looking at the chat while I'm parsing the questions and reading them out at the end. I'll be looking at the Q&A box. So any questions, please use the Q&A box. Usually we have our events manager, Padma Ghosh, to kind of manage the background of Zoom. Today, Padma is still on leave in India. So we have Will Beharrell, our librarian, who will be dealing with all the Zoom backgrounds. So hopefully, I'm sure it'll be fine, actually. Sorry, Will. And so finally, to our speaker, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Sandy Knapp, former president of the Linnean Society, FRS, and recently OBE. So congratulations, Sandy. Sandy is a researcher at the NHM, the Natural History Museum in London, and she specializes on the taxonomy of the nightshade family Solanaceae. Sandy was actually just this weekend representing the Linnean Society at a tree planting in Usk in Wales, which is Wallace's birthplace, to commemorate the 200 years since Wallace's birth. And she was representing the Linnean Society there. I can't remember which type of tree you planted, but you can say that later on, Sandy. Sandy's very familiar with Wallace's work, and one of the books that she has written is Footsteps in the Forest, Alfred Russel Wallace in the Amazon, and we can put a link to that work as well in our chat in a minute. And that was published in 1999. So there's no better person to talk to you about Alfred Russel Wallace and his manuscript Palms of the Amazon, which is kept in our collection. So over to you, Sandy. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Isabel. Well, I'm just going to share my screen and start straight away. Let's see if I can do this. Yep. So I think I'll just start right off. But first, I want to thank Isabel and thank everybody who has supported me. She said that I've received these honors this year, but actually any honor that anyone receives is actually due to the people that you work with, because it's the people you work with and the people who interact with you, which are really what make your work exciting. And that's what makes being a scientist exciting as well, is all those different people that you work with. And I think that's something that Alfred Russel Wallace definitely felt. He was a people person and was really interested in people. And I hope by the end of today, you'll agree with me that his study of natural history also was very focused around people. So in 1848, Alfred Russel Wallace and his friend Henry Walter Bates, shown here, Wallace on the left and Bates on the right, my right, my left, I can never remember how it works in Zoom, it's terrible, is they set off for the Amazon. Both of them had been in Leicester together, in Leicester in the United Kingdom together. Bates had introduced Wallace to the study of beetles. Wallace was a botanist before that. He was really interested in plants. And they set off to the Amazon because they wanted to go somewhere to look at the species problem. They wanted to look at the origin of species. Why were there so many different species of things? Now, I've got to figure out how to change the slides. Oh, here we go. Okay, so when they got to the Amazon, they went on a ship, as all travel was. And then today we can fly to the Amazon in a matter of hours, but then it took a bit longer. They discovered that the Amazon was actually a very watery world, very, very different to anything that they had been used to in the past. And they were a bit disappointed when they first got there as well, because part of their reason for going to the Amazon was a book that was written by this man, W.H. Edwards, called A Voyage Up the River Amazon, including a residence at Para. Para then is what is now called Belém. And he talked about vast numbers of trees, flower-domed forest, many colored altars, wild luxuriance of monkeys frolicking through festooned bowers. You can imagine what two young men from Britain felt that the tropics was going to be like. But actually, the tropical rainforest is a very different thing. What they were confronted with was green. Green, 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 very, very tall trees, and something where you didn't see animals very often, and there weren't a lot of flowers. And that's really what a tropical rainforest is like. Wallace was fascinated by the shapes of trees, and you can see here on the left one of his pictures of these buttress trees, these phenomenal buttresses. And you can see what skill Wallace had at drawing. He was an incredibly good artist. Now, before they left London, they had corresponded with the great and the good at Kew, William Jackson Hooker at the Natural History Museum, various people in the fish and insect departments, to get advice about how to collect, what kinds of things people were interested in. They'd also hired an agent, Samuel Stevens, to manage those collections that they would send from the Amazon for sale in the auction houses of London, because that's how they financed their voyage. They weren't the kind of people who were grace and favor on a ship. These young men had to make their own way. So once they were in the Amazon, they wrote back to people in London, and this is some excerpts from a letter from Wallace to Hooker, to William Jackson Hooker from Brazil in 1848, in the first few months or so that they were in the area of the mouth of the Amazon, saying, "We've hitherto found it quite enough to do, attending almost entirely to insects, that they were starting with birds, but it will be quite impossible to find time to make anything of a general collection of plants." And then again, in the same letter, he sort of apologizes again, saying, "I fear I shall never find any time to collect plants, but should I meet with anything very curious, I will endeavor to preserve it." And then this interesting PS at the end, which you'll see why this is important in a minute, is, "I send a few dried plants, a few hundred specimens, principally ferns. You can perhaps dispose of them or allow what you consider them to be worth." And this is pretty odd, because these young men were making their way by collecting and being paid for collections. So the fact that they were sending things to Hooker that he could dispose of is, I think, pretty extraordinary. Wallace soon became fascinated by that part of tropical rainforest which is so peculiar to them, but also such an incredibly beautiful part of tropical rainforest, which is the palms. And he, in his introduction to the palm trees of the Amazon, which I'll share with you in a minute, is, "Everywhere too rise the graceful palms, true denizens of the tropics." And he endeavored to familiarize himself with every aspect of every species, but also, and this is part of what interested me about Wallace and his interest in palms, and he wanted to learn each by its native name. So he wanted to learn not only the scientific names for these palms and what they were botanically, but he also wanted to know what their natives' names were and how people interacted with them. So he set about thinking about palms. And this is a bit of a cul-de-sac, but when I first started thinking about Wallace and the Amazon and the palms of the Amazon, we thought, well, there's no evidence that any of his collections ever made it back from the Amazon, and there's no evidence he collected any plants, so there probably aren't any. But then, working with Bill Baker here in a much younger photo, both of us were much younger in those days, we found stashed away in the back of a cupboard, a Kew, a bag which included some specimens which look like this, stems of palms that were labeled A.R. Wallace, Amazon. So he had sent something back to Hooker, and Hooker had not incorporated these into the collection. They're not the normal kind of specimens that we put in a collection, which you can see in the cupboard behind Bill, what normal herbarium specimens look like. But these were something that had been sent back to Hooker and had languished in the back of this cupboard at Kew for a very, very long time. Suffice it to say that they now are no languishing in the back of a cupboard, and they're properly curated and displayed, but they're still not the same kinds of specimens that botanists are used to collecting. And this is a specimen of something called Moritiella armata, the Buricitillo palm. And this was described in Palms of the Amazon by Wallace as Moretia pumila. And here you can see the palm itself and then the specimen that was collected by Wallace. And you can imagine how difficult palm specimens are to collect. They're large organisms. The leaves are very big. So he was collecting those parts that he thought showed how they grew. But on the way back from his Amazon adventures, which were quite extraordinary, and you can read about in the book, The Footsteps in the Forest, or in fact in Wallace's own book about his travels in the Amazon, which is absolutely wonderful. His ship caught on fire, and he rushed to his cabin, collected one tiny tin box, which had in it drawings of fishes and drawings of palms, a couple of shirts, and then the ship burned. And they were in a lifeboat for many days until they were finally rescued and ended up back in Britain. Well, thank goodness his agent, Samuel Stevens, had taken out insurance on his collections to the tune of £200, rather, forget which country I'm in, £200, and he managed to salvage more clothes and things, from that insurance. He moved in with his mother and sister near Regent's Park and proceeded to write 2 books about his adventures in the Amazon, one of which was called A Naturalist on the River Amazon, and was an account of his journey. And it was sort of sad, because you think about him writing this book, and he wrote it entirely from memory. This book was written completely from memory, and Darwin wrote to Hooker, Joseph Hooker, saying, well, it's really sad, but it's an absence of facts in this book. And he's the poor guy, give him a break. He lost all of his collections. But the other book he wrote, and the book he wrote first, was The Palm Trees of the Amazon and Their Uses. This was published in 1853. There were only 250 copies of this book published. And this is a book I have the great privilege of being able to share with you today. But this book, the important thing about this book, I think, is the subtitle. This is not just about palm trees. This is also about palm trees and their uses. So this is also about the people with whom he interacted in the Amazon, for whom he had great respect, regardless of the language with which he wrote about them at the time. That book was also panned. William Jackson Hooker, reviewing Palm Trees of the Amazon in Hooker's Journal of Botany, said this work is certainly more suited to the drawing room table than to the library of a botanist. Essentially, this is not a book for people like us. And Richard Spruce, who was a friend of Wallace's, with whom he had collected and met whilst he was in the Amazon, wrote to Hooker saying, the striking fault in the figures of the larger species is that the stem is much too thick compared to the length of the fronds, and that the latter has only half as many pinnae as they ought to have. The descriptions are worse than nothing, in many cases not mentioning a single circumstance that a botanist would most desire to know, but the accounts of uses are good. So again, this was not seen as a book for botanists. And you can see here, and I'll do a little bit more comparison later, is on the bottom is Wallace's drawing of a plant, and on the top is the lithograph that was published in the book. And so you can see kind of what Spruce was talking about. But Wallace's palm book is not only good for uses, but it's also really important for actually the taxonomy of palms. So in his book, he described 11 species as new to science. And of these, 4 are still known by the scientific names Wallace gave them. And those are Leopoldinia major, Leopoldinia piassaba, which actually the fronds of which were the major source of brooms in Britain at the time. So this was a major palm of commerce that had no scientific name before Wallace gave it one. Euterpe catinga and Mauritia carana. So those 4 palm names are still attributed to Wallace. But as Spruce said, the accounts of the uses are good. And this to me shows how Wallace, unlike other botanists of the time or other natural historians of the time, was very, very interested not only in the natural history of the plants and animals of the places he looked at, but also in how those plants and animals were used sustainably and usefully by the people of the region that he worked in. So here's a picture of a maloca, which is a communal hut up the Rio Valpais. And you can see in the inset how he very carefully drew exactly how the fronds of Mauritia, the big palm that grows in that area, were used to create the thatch on the roof, which is incredibly good waterproof thatch. And on the right, you can see something that looks like a long tube hooked over a rod. And that is something that's very, very important in the culture and the food culture of the area in which he was traveling. And this is something that is used to extract starch and flour from the cassava plant, which is the main source of carbohydrates in the region where he was traveling. And what happens with this is that you put the ground cassava in the top and then put a stick through that loop in the bottom, and then you pull down on that. It's like one of those things that you put on your finger that you pull on and you can't get off your finger. So it squeezes the cassava, the ground cassava, until all the moisture comes out, and then that's dried and used as farinha, which Wallace totally fell in love with and wrote when he came back from the Amazon to Bates. He wrote that he missed farinha hugely. So he was very interested in the uses to which these plants were put. And in the introduction of his book, he's actually typically rather modest. He says, to the botanist, I trust my little book may be of some use, of giving pictures of the whole plants with which botanists are really only acquainted with tiny parts, and in supplying an account of the uses to which they are applied. And he also addresses the general reader. So to the general reader, I hope it may not be uninteresting, as exhibiting a glimpse of people in the lowest state of civilization. Now those words, you bristle at those words today, but at his time, this is how people wrote, whose existence is intimately connected with the products of the surrounding forests, among which the plants under consideration hold so prominent a place. So his book was not just for botanists, unlike what Hooker and Spruce thought. It was actually for everyone, for a general reader, to introduce them to something about the tropics, which was super special, not only to him, but also to the people who lived there, and he hoped also to people who read his book. So I'd now like to share with you Wallace's Palm Trees of the Amazon, so you too can see how he went about making this extraordinary book, of which only 250 copies were ever published. It's been reproduced as facsimile since then, but at the time, this was an incredibly rare book and something that people didn't think would really sell. So I'm just going to move to the book itself and just show you how he put it together, because, oops, I'm just rolling over various kind of things. One of the things he put the book together almost as those books, that your children write when they're creating books with their own sketches. This is his manuscript copy of the book, sketches of the palms of the Amazon, and he puts his address in there and puts his various bits. But what he's done is he's pasted, and there's that picture of Leopoldinia piassava. There's a map of the distribution of Leopoldinia. And what's fascinating about this is Wallace was always fascinated about distribution. And here in red, you can see the distribution of this piassava palm. And it's distributed in very specific types of soils. And today, Leopoldinia is still known basically from this distribution that Wallace made of it. So he didn't go to all of these places necessarily, but what he did is he asked local people. He asked local people where this palm was to be found. And because it was a palm of commerce, that meant that people really did know where it was. And he, rather than suggesting they didn't know what they were talking about, he really respected the knowledge of the people in the region, knowing where these palms were to be found. But you can see here that he's put it together, and he's got all of his text, plus then he's pasted in that drawing, delicate drawings in pencil that were taken in that tiny tin box when he rushed from the sinking Helen and was the one thing he saved. So rather than keeping them separate, which is what we often do today when we publish books, all of the plates and everything are kept separately, he then pasted them into this. So it must have been an interesting challenge. But they're absolutely beautiful, these gorgeous drawings. And let's compare a couple of these. I just want to show you how I kind of feel about Wallace's pictures versus the pictures. So if you look at this, I'm going to put it a little bit closer to the camera so you can see the real detail and the beautiful lifelike leaves. They're feathery. They have a life of their own, the leaves of this picture. This is Mauritia carana, one of the palms he described himself. And I'll just move this briefly and then show you that same picture from the published book. So this is that same palm in the published book. And you can see that it's not nearly as beautiful and lifelike as that picture in Wallace's book itself. I'm going to put that up again because it's one of my absolute favorite ones. So it's just beautiful. So why were those pictures so wooden in the published book of the Palm Trees of the Amazon? Well, they were done as lithographs by the premier botanical artist of the day, Walter Hood Fitch. And I thought, well, maybe when I was writing about this, I thought, well, maybe those pictures are actually wooden because of lithography. Maybe lithography is really difficult to get this beautiful kind of feathery lightness of these original drawings, these pencil sketches of Wallace's. Maybe that's why these are like that. But actually, I went to the Royal College of Art and talked to the lithographers, and they said, no, that's not the case. You could do that just like that with lithography, but it's perhaps someone was trying to do it in a hurry, and as a result, it became somewhat cartoon-like. So who knows what, I tried to find correspondence about it, but there's really no correspondence about Fitch doing this. But you can see on the other side of this page that you can see his writing about this. So first thing he does is he writes about the species itself, and then he talks about the leaf stalks are split up for the same purposes as the muriti and jubati already described, and the leaves are very extensively used for thatching. Indeed, an account of them being constantly cut, it is hardly possible to find an entire handsome tree. So he's saying how much these plants are used by the people of the region. So the fascinating thing that I love about the palm trees of the Amazon is the way in which he not only sketched the whole plants for people who would have never been to the tropics and never known what a whole palm tree looked like, but he also talked about how they were used by people who would have felt very foreign to people back in Britain. And here's another one of these palms, which is a small one that has a very interesting shaped fruit. And he's got those two sketches side by side. So Wallace not only drew palm trees in the Amazon, as I showed you back in the talk a little bit earlier, he also looked, he sketched other things like trees. And I just thought I'd show a few of the other sketches which are here at the Linnean Society. I mean, I could spend all day talking about Wallace and the palm trees of the Amazon, but there are a few other really beautiful things that just show the skill of Wallace the artist as well. And this is another one of these trees with incredibly interesting buttresses that he's drawn. And you can imagine there's not an animal in this picture, not a butterfly, not a monkey, just the tree itself. And he actually, I think, realized that plants were really important at that time. He was also really interested in some of the things he saw up on the upper Rio Negro, things like rock art that was done by indigenous people long ago in the upper Amazon. And he reproduced these things faithfully in these sketches, which were, luckily for us, part of that tiny box that he saved. And these drawings are all held in the Linnean Society. And he was also quite interested in looking at these, and I can imagine him trying to speak with people on the upper Amazon about what these meant and what their ancestors did with these, because he would have been very interested, because he always was interested in what people did. And he was interested in the towns and everything else as well. And I just want to show a couple more things of artifacts made from palms. So this is a palm comb, which is put in people's hair. There's a boat and a paddle. And I actually have a paddle that looks very much like this from Panama, from the Darien in Panama. So these kinds of things are still used today. So as are the fish traps, which he very carefully drew as well. And these fish traps are made, again, from pieces of palm. So these are all made from pieces of palm. And you can see how this fish trap works, is the fish swim in this end, and then try to swim back out and can't get back out. And he diagrams exactly how it's deployed in the river itself. And these fish traps are still used today. But so you can see how he was not just interested in just collecting butterflies and birds for commerce, which is often how his collections, collecting expeditions are portrayed, or often how collecting expeditions of people at the time are portrayed. But Wallace himself was very interested in how people use their environment, but also how they use their environment sustainably, in a way that he knew in Britain the environment was not necessarily being used sustainably in that sort of way. So he collected, became very ill on the upper Amazon, and eventually decided to go home and made it back down to the town of Manaus. And this is his sketch. Anyone who's been to Manaus knows now, Manaus, after the rubber boom, is a huge city. It has an opera house. It has a post office designed by Eiffel, the same person who designed the Eiffel Tower. It's an extraordinarily big city. But this is Bara from the fort, and this is Manaus at the time that Wallace was stuck there trying to get his collections out of customs in order to take them down to the mouth of the Amazon, load them on the ship, and bring them back to England with him. He, as is so often the case, had a trouble with the customs officials, trouble getting his collections out of the country, trouble figuring all of this out, but he eventually did, went down, loaded them on the Helen, which is the ship I talked about earlier, and was ready to go back to England. But unfortunately, all of those collections that he spent all that time in Manaus trying to get out of customs, getting out of customs, the observations he made, all were gone in that fire on the Hellenes as they crossed the Atlantic. So all of that time could have been seen to have been wasted, but actually for Wallace, nothing was ever wasted. That book, he created the book, The Palm Trees of the Amazon, from his sketches, again from memory, and he also recreated his own Amazon journeys, again from memory. And this is a picture of an area where he walked, actually barefoot, to go and find the white cock of the rock. But what I think is amazing about that whole trip to the Amazon and about this book, The Palm Trees of the Amazon, which I'm going to show again, because I think it's one of the most amazing things, is that all of this is written from memory. This is written without notes, from what he remembered and from his drawings. And so having those drawings and thinking about his audience, because when we publish books, we always think about our audience. And for him, the audience was not botanists. It was not just scientists. His audience was also for people who were the general reader, people who perhaps he wanted to give a little taste of how amazing the tropics actually were. So I hope that you've liked looking at some of these beautiful drawings of the palm trees of the Amazon and got a little taste of what Wallace might have felt and the love with which he put this together. Because not only did he write it all out by hand, there are various kind of corrections, grammatical corrections, various corrections of spelling, but this was presumably what he gave to the publisher to create the book, The Palm Trees of the Amazon, which is a truly wonderful book. It's not a botanical book. It's, in a way, the very first field guide that would allow people to actually identify things from their whole space. So I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope that you have lots of questions about the palm trees of the Amazon. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sandy. It's extraordinary to think that because I was going to ask a question about the text and say, you know, how did any of the notes survive from the fire, but clearly not. And it's extraordinary to think that he wrote it all from memory.
What did survive from the fire in terms of notes is a notebook in which he wrote about the fishes, but that's very, very difficult to, it was very water damaged. So it's and that's held at the Natural History Museum. And that one you can, it has things like measurements of the fishes, but not narrative. There's no narrative notes at all.
I wonder, I mean, there are a few questions already. I'm just wondering if we should go back to the document just to leaf through it just a little bit more. I don't know. What do you think?
Let's do that. Let's do that page by page. So I'll just take you through it, because we start with the very first page. And then he has his preface, in which he says things like, typically Wallace, you know, I am indebted to the magnificent work of Dr. Martius. For the rest, I am myself responsible, and trust that the information given may not be altogether useless to the botanist or uninteresting to the general reader. So he actually expanded his introduction in the published work, but this is what he wrote. So you can see that he actually was really thinking about everybody, all kinds of readers, a big wide audience when he wrote it. And he starts in by sort of looking at a map. So he was really a geographer. Wallace was really a geographer. So here he planned for a map. He doesn't have a sketch map. But in the published work, there is a map showing the distribution of palms in the Americas. He has a bit about palms in general, And then he talks in quite poetic language. It's quite poetic language what he says about palms. He says, some stand erect like the columns of a giant temple. Others bend their slender trunks in graceful curves, while others again trail thin, long, flexible stems over trees and shrubs and hang in festoons between them. So he was obviously very taken with these plants, and I love the way, I've always loved the way Wallace writes, but this is sort of the first book of his that was made for public consumption. And you can see that writing style of his in its early stages in this manuscript. Changed a bit in the published book, but I love the poetic language with which he writes. So he talks about palms themselves. So there's an introduction about palms. And he says, in the following pages, I've given sketches of the different species I have met with on the Amazon and Upper Rio Negro. And then, so this is the blue paper in which the palms, a folder in which the drawings of palms were probably kept in his tin box that he had with him in his own cabin. And here is the first of those drawings pasted onto that folder. And he's got the name of the palm, who described it, Martius, and its common name, Jara. And then this is not in the published book, but that says Lingua Geral, and that's the common language of the Amazon. Because in the Amazon, many different peoples, many different communities, many different languages are still spoken today by different peoples in different parts of the Amazon. And Wallace went through and talked to many different people. He made a great effort to learn this lingua geral because he wanted to talk to people. So he gives that name in that common language. In his book about the Amazon itself, he has a glossary at the back which has lots and lots of different words how those words are said in several different indigenous languages, and also in this lingua geral. So he kind of tells you where it's found and everything, and it's wonderful because it tells you. So it says the tree gets old, the lower part rots. So here it's rotting and falls or is rubbed off, and leaves the stem bare, which is smooth and faintly scarred in rings. So you can close your eyes and with his writing almost imagine what this plant looks like, or look at the picture and imagine that as something quite large. Because he gives the dimensions of each of these as well. This particular one, the little Jara miri, is 10 to 15 feet high, and the stem is about 2 inches in diameter. So he really paints a word picture to go with his drawing. And there he's got a fence in the city of Bara made from the trunks of this particular palm. And then he has Leopoldinia piassava, which was an incredibly important palm of commerce, as I said at the time. Those leaves that coat the stem were made of, this is Leopoldinia major, Leopoldinia piassava, Euterpe. It's slightly out of order, his manuscript, but that doesn't really matter. This is Euterpe, Caatinga. So this is the picture that goes with this text, which is on the other page. Oh, and here's one of these wonderful little drawings of a palm with a person attached. And you can see Wallace was not great at drawing people. His pictures of people were not nearly as good as his pictures of palms. This is Euterpe is the palm from which hearts of palm come. And the industry of hearts of palm is actually not very sustainable, because hearts of palm require cutting down the palm tree, which in many species kills the tree. So the over-harvesting of hearts of palm has been a major problem in palm conservation. But there are some hearts of palm which come from palms which you cut and they sprout from the base.
I might interject with questions because I see them growing and growing.
No, I know. I can see them growing as well. Okay, let's go to acute questions, and we can look at so we don't miss any of them. Yeah.
There's a couple of questions just asking how long he spent there.
He spent about 4.5 years. because he left in 1848. This book was published in 1853. He came back sort of 1852-ish, I think. I'm really horrible at dates. I'm so sorry, but it was about 4 years. He didn't spend nearly as long in the Amazon as he had spent in the Malay Archipelago. The Malay Archipelago, for which he's quite justly kind of one of the world's great collectors, was a much longer field journey than was his time in the Amazon. He basically, his little brother, Herbert, had come out to help him in the Amazon as an assistant, and decided that natural history was not for him. It was just like way too hard of work, you know, just not really his thing at all. So he went back to come back to England, but actually ended up dying of yellow fever in Belém a few days before he was to board the boat. So Wallace, most of his time up the Rio Negro. So he went up the Rio Negro and the Rio Valpais, which are two big tributaries of the Amazon itself. And his time in the Rio Negro, he was alone. He wasn't alone. He was with local people, but he didn't have someone who was helping him collect or was a companion for him. He had people he hired to take canoes and things. And he got very ill high up on the Rio Negro. He had a bout of malaria, and he recounts in his book on the Amazon, lying in his hammock, very ill, and hearing the woman of the house where he was staying discussing with one of her neighbors how they would divide up his possessions when he died. And he says he remembers at that time swearing to himself that he would never again go collecting without a companion, without someone with him. And what's interesting is people often interpret that as being without someone European with him, because he was the first sort of European to be in those places. There were people there, of course, and he recognized that there had been people there for millennia. I mean, he saw that rock art, for example, and was fascinated by the history of people in the Amazon. But when he was in the Malay Archipelago, he, of course, started out, not of course, but he did start out with other Europeans as his companions. But actually his most faithful companion, and the person with whom he spent the majority of his time and respected hugely, was Ali, a young Malay man who collected with Wallace, who helped Wallace prepare his specimens, who talked about specimens with Wallace, and that was really his companion. And that's what he meant, is he needed someone to talk to, because when you're alone in the field in a strange place with people who are not like you, or are perhaps not interested in the same things as you, it can be very, very lonely. And I think Wallace got very lonely high up on the Rio Negro, and he then decided it was time to go home. Spruce, and Bates, both of whom he knew in the Amazon, Bates, who went with him, of course, to the Amazon. Bates spent many more years in the Amazon than Wallace did. But I think Wallace I think the bout with malaria, his brother dying, all of this just compounded, and he decided, right, time to go home.
So you mentioned companions. There's a question here that is a little bit more in that kind of area. Was there any reference to any native collectors in his works?
No, there are not references to native collectors. There are many references to the people with which he traveled. And I'm sure they helped him collect, but there aren't necessarily any native collectors. He was in places, so collecting insects and birds in the way that we Europeans do it is not something that's done in places like the Amazon. I mean, people use organisms in their everyday life. So as he recorded in the palm trees of the Amazon, the palms are used by people, but that's not the same as collecting something. I think collecting, I mean, when I've been in the Amazon, in Latin America, in South America, collecting, it's I start pressing plants, and gangs of thousands of small children and adults from villages gather around and cannot figure out what I'm doing. You know, it's completely foreign. So there weren't collectors per se, but he does mention people with whom he traveled, and his admiration for how they can move in the forest and how they know the forest as he would know maybe the streets of Leicester or the streets of London.
Thank you. There's quite a few. There's a few on the artwork. So Helen says, given the quality of Wallace's drawings, do we know if he had any formal art training?
He didn't have any. He sort of had formal art training in school, but he was the art master. He was the drawing master at a school in Leicester. So he was employed as someone teaching drawing. So he had sort of probably rudimentary training as part of sort of an English education. He wasn't very good at school. He was super rubbish at school and didn't stay in school longer than the age of 14. So he wasn't schooled, as it were. But he was a drawing master in Leicestershire, in the Leicester school. So he obviously had some talent that was recognized by other people. So he was quite talented, I think, as an artist.
Yeah, and there's a couple of questions saying how many actual drawings and illustrations by Wallace survive from his time in the Amazon, and have they all been digitized? So the ones I can reply just for the Linnean Society, the digitized, the manuscript is digitized, the individual drawings, and you can find it all on our website. The individual drawings may have been photographed, but they're not yet on our website. But that, I don't know if that encompasses all of the illustrations from his time then.
No, there are probably, I think there are, let me just look in the book briefly, how many plates there are of palms. There are 48 palms of plates of palms published in the book. So there are 48, or I think there are 48 in the palm trees of the Amazon. Then there's probably another 10 or 12, which are of uses of things and of trees and of various other things. And then there are all the fishes, of which there are very many. And those are held at the Natural History Museum. And those are indeed digitized and available. They were put together as a book, published, authored by Alfred Russel Wallace, put together at the time of the 500th anniversary of the country of Brazil. So they're called Wallace's Fishes of the Rio Negro, and they're beautiful. They're the same sort of size as these drawings of the palms, that same sort of the size of your hand, kind of small. And there are several hundred of those, and those are all digitized.
Okay, thank you. There's quite a few questions as well about the ferns that you mentioned, I think at the beginning. Yeah.
So ferns, fascinating.
Yeah. So
I've,
he said, well,
yeah. So
shall I, well, there's one question that says, with the ferns he posted back, did they survive? Was the first one.
Well, as far as I can tell, I've never been able to find any ferns from the Amazon, but mind you, I haven't gone specimen by specimen through Kew's collections. And he would have sent them to William Hooker, who at that time in the 1840s, the Royal Botanical Gardens Kew as a herbarium hadn't really yet been established. So Hooker probably would have thought of them as being part of his Museum of Economic Botany, which is probably where those big palm pieces were destined for, was that Museum of Economic Botany. So they weren't necessarily specimens. Where I have found fern specimens from, though, however, is from Borneo. So in both the Natural History Museum herbarium and the Kew herbarium, there are specimens of ferns from Borneo that are collected by Wallace. And so I don't know how many. I've only been able to find 3 so far, but as Kew is in the process of digitizing their entire herbarium, one day we'll be able to find out.
Thank you. And related to the palms that are in the ones that you showed the picture of at the beginning, someone is asking what restrictions of care was taken to prevent contamination to European specimen. I assume that links to those specimens.
Well, whenever specimens come into a collection, to a natural history collection, whether it be the Linnean collection or the Natural History Museum collection or the Kew collection, there various methods for dealing with pests are done. So what would have been done at the time is, that's why they're kept in sealed plastic bags probably now, but there weren't plastic bags in 1848, let's face it. And so they would have in some way been disinfected. I have no idea how they would have been disinfected. And the important thing is not European specimens, it's other specimens in the collection. So what would have been important for Hooker, for example, and I don't know well, the way specimens used to be disinfected was by dipping them in mercury. This was one of the ways in which specimens were decontaminated, was to dip them in a solution of mercury, which is not very good for the people who were looking after the collections, and is actually a huge hazard in collections today to people curating collections. We monitor mercury levels in some of our old collections extremely carefully. Today, what we do with specimens when they come in from anywhere, not just from the tropics, but from anywhere, even from another institution, is we freeze them for 48 to 72 hours, which kills any insects which are on them, because the biggest pest for herbarium specimens, for dried plants, is insects, things like cigarette beetles, which will just eat them up. So we freeze them today. So I'm sure something would have been done at the time. I don't know what would have been done.
And on these palm cuttings as well, someone's asking whether they've been used in any research and in what capacity are they being displayed. I assume they're just part of the herbarium.
Well, Bill and Lynn and I, Lynn Saunders and I wrote a paper about them in 2005. I think we wrote a paper in the journal called Palms, which is Alfred Russel Wallace's Palms of the Amazon, in which we documented all of the palms collections that we found, what they were, how they corresponded to the palm trees of the Amazon. So yes, we have done research on them, and they're still useful for people researching palms today. Not so much for many of the things that people who study palms want to know, like floral morphology or how the leaves are, but they're important for seeing how the inflorescences come out of the leaf sheaths, for example. So herbarium specimens are used over and over, and specimens of plants in general, and insects and birds, are actually used over and over again by generations and generations of scientists who look at them. They aren't looked at once and then set aside. They're used again and again because we have new techniques and new ways of looking at them, which allow us to use them, which is why collections, including the one here at the Linnean Society, are so important, is because they're the evidence of something occurring somewhere at some time. And you can always go back to it and make sure that a previous author was right when they said it had 4 leaves or round fruits, and look again. So they're that evidence base that we use in studying taxonomy and systematics. So yeah, they are used in research. I don't know exactly what research they're used in now, and they're kept in the Palm collection in purpose-made boxes at the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew now.
Thank you. I see that someone have their hand up, and I'll come back to you because there's quite a lot of questions still in the Q&A, but I'm aware of your hand, and 2 hands are up. So we may be able to give you to allow to speak, but if you can put it in the chat, that would be easier. So yeah.
It's hard to manage all of these things at once.
Yeah.
I know exactly how Isabel feels, because I did this the whole way through the pandemic, trying to manage all the questions and everything. It's really difficult.
I'm trying to parse them together. So there's quite a few about the botany of Wallace's Palms of the Amazon. So several questions to do with, are these species that are he describes still fully botanical recognizable today? And is there any correlation between the native taxonomy of the palms and their scientific classification? So I think it's to do with, Wallace's classification, his use of possible native indigenous names, and their own taxonomy, and the taxonomy of today, really.
Yeah, so what he did is he didn't do a comprehensive account of the palm trees of the Amazon. This is in no way a comprehensive account. It's, as he says in his introduction, these are the palms that I encountered. So these are the palm trees that he saw. So this is him describing what he saw from life. And it's not organized in a classificatory way. He gives them the names. So he uses a lot of them. He uses the names that were given to these palms by the great Martius, a German botanist who traveled in the Amazon, who was a specialist in palms. So he has those names. He describes 11 species as new species that he thought were new to science, of which he gave names to, right? So there are 11 that he thought were new. Of those 11, 7 of those already had names that were given by somebody else. People now consider Wallace's name a synonym of a name that came earlier, because in botany we have the rule that whichever is the name that's proposed first, things that a taxonomist thinks belong in the same clump as that, are the same species as that, you use the name that's the oldest. But 4 of these species, and that's quite a lot, 4 of these species from the palm trees of the Amazon are still known by the name that Wallace gave them. So Wallace was the first person to give them a scientific name. So yes, many of these are known by the same names. Many of them are known by the same names that Wallace called them that are attributed to somebody else, like Astracarium humili or this Enocarpus bacaba. You know, those are things that they had names before. And so you can see here on this page, is this showing still? Well, yes. You can see here, it says Enocarpus minor Mart. Mart means Martius. So he's using a name that Martius gave to this plant, but he's describing it from what he saw himself. So it's a kind of complicated, I'm not sure if that really answers the question, but it's more, yes, he did give some things new names, and we still do know those by their new names. And some of them are known by the names that Martius gave them. Some of them have been moved into other genera, but all of them are names which we still record and use today in some kind of way.
So actually, let's, because there's a question about Martius and how much Wallace was influenced by Martius' palm publication.
Hugely. In the introduction, as I said earlier, at the very beginning of the book, he says, I owe a great debt to Dr. Martius for his work on Amazon palms. So he acknowledges the fact that Martius, that he's not the first person to write about palms. And in a way, that's typical Wallace. He's pretty humble. And he says, you know, I hope this book is going to be useful for botanists because it's got figures of the whole thing. And I hope it's also interesting to the general reader. So he acknowledges the fact that he's not a palm expert. He knows he's not a palm expert. And he acknowledges the debt to which he owes Martius, who was a palm expert.
And someone else asks, did Wallace talk about palms in relation to other plant groups, or is it too soon? And thoughts on relationships and evolution. And I'm going to come to evolution because there's quite a lot of questions related to theory of evolution, are much later development.
I think that because Wallace and Bates went to the Amazon with the idea to look at the origin of species, they were thinking about what we today call evolution by natural selection. Evolution was an idea that was around long before Darwin and Wallace ever thought of it. It was around at the time of Darwin's grandfather. People were thinking about evolution. All evolution means is change. Things evolve, things change. People knew things change. Vestiges of the Origins of Creation by Robert Chambers actually brought those ideas to the fore. So evolution is not something that just sprang into being with Darwin and Wallace. It was kind of in the zeitgeist of natural history of the day, is that it was clear that life had changed. I think those ideas were very much behind Wallace thinking about geography. When he wrote a paper that he sent back to the Zoological Society from the Amazon about monkeys. And he says that Spix, who's another Amazon explorer, in his account of the monkeys of the Amazon, neglects to say on which side of the Amazon they occur, because in Wallace's experience, they're very different on one side of the Amazon to the other. So he was always quite obsessed about where things occurred. And you can see that in his map of Leopoldinia piassava in the palm trees of the Amazon, which I can just go back to, is you know, he was really interested in where things occurred. And so I think a lot of these ideas, he was thinking the background to all of these ideas, and all of what he wrote and all of what he thought was this thing about the origin of species, is why were there so many different things? And Wallace very much came at this idea from geography. He very much came at this idea from the distribution of things, which is a very different way than Darwin arrived at the same idea.
That's great. Sorry, I'm strong.
I'm so sorry.
No,
I can't see the questions. So I'm just relying, Isabel, I'm totally relying on Isabel, who's just right over there in the room.
I don't think we've ever had so many questions on the Linnean lens, which is great, but I apologize in advance because I don't think we're going to go through all of them. So let me find, we were on botany, my whole...
Yeah, so classification, there was a part of that was about classification. So while you do the next one, so I'll sort of talk about classification. So he wasn't thinking about classification in terms of what we think of as classification, like plant families, or palms have been recognized as something distinct for a long, long time. And Wallace's interest in natural history actually began with his studies of the British flora, and his book that he took around with him while he was apprenticed as a surveyor to his brother William was Lindley's Conspectus of British Botany, a concise British botany. So he knew about plant families, and he knew about, he knew about those kinds of things, but I don't think he was so interested in classification per se. If you look at all of the writings of Wallace, he never did a sort of taxonomic work. I think the palm trees of the Amazon is the closest he comes to a taxonomic work. He was much more interested in the relationships of one thing to another, and also in distribution and where things occurred. So I think that's why the Malay Archipelago was so amazing for him, is because it's a kind of Pandora's box of distributions, all those islands, all those different geologies and things. But I think he wasn't so much concerned, unlike sort of a herbarium taxonomist or a museum taxonomist, he was not so concerned with putting things into boxes. He, in all of his writing, and it comes out in the palm trees of the Amazon as well, he's interested in interrelationships of things.
Yeah, and there is a question here asking about his scientific classification and whether he came up with these from purely morphological data.
Yes, it would have been purely morphological. What else did he have?
Yeah. Yeah.
He didn't have anything else.
No.
DNA hadn't been discovered until more than 100 years later.
And whether what literature he took with him to the Amazon to inform.
There is a list of the literature that he took with him, or in his book, The Amazon, and I can't really remember exactly. It's in my Footsteps of the Forest, and he may have had a copy of Martius's Palms, but I don't think so, because it's quite a big book. So he took, there's never a lot of space when you're a young man going in canoes from one place to another. So he didn't have a lot of literature. So much of the kind of figuring out what things were in terms of their names probably happened when he was back in London. So he probably didn't necessarily know the names, the scientific names of many of the palms in the Amazon. I don't know, because none of us were there. So we don't know if he had Martius or not, but he would have done research on these quite quickly, to be fair, once he was back in London.
And let's stay with the practicalities of collecting and traveling. Someone asked whether he used a vasculum, and I think there is a picture, because of course we know Darwin used a vasculum. It's in our collections. It's actually on display in the library. But I think there is a picture of Wallace with a vasculum, or am I imagining it?
I think you might be imagining it.
Okay.
Oh no, it might be that picture of that's in Bates's book of Wallace being mobbed by toucans. There's a picture of Wallace being mobbed by toucans, which everybody always says it's Bates being mobbed by toucans, but actually it's Wallace being, you can tell because of the glasses, but it's Wallace being mobbed by toucans. And I think he might have something that looks a bit like a vasculum in that picture. I can't really quite remember exactly what that looks like. We can probably find it and put it up here, but he probably would have actually abandoned it quite soon. Those palm things that he collected are way too big to go in a vasculum. So he wouldn't have used a vasculum for that. And he wasn't really collecting plants. He really wasn't collecting plants. He was collecting butterflies and birds, because those were what you could sell in the auction rooms in London, and were how he was funding his travels. So I think if he had a vasculum, it probably got shed very early on.
Thank you. We're going to have to close, but just one last question. I'm awfully sorry to everyone who's asked questions and we haven't had time to get to them. Do go back to Sandy's book to find the answers.
It's got another edition. It's got a second edition, which is
oh, this is the library copy. You're very welcome to come into the library and
yeah, absolutely,
and read it here too. It's a tiny question, but it goes back to W.H. Edwards, whose photograph you had with Wallace at the beginning, and the person is asking what happened to him.
What the photograph I had at the beginning was Bates. Was Henry
Yes, it
Walter
was
Bates.
Bates. Sorry. Yeah.
It was Henry Walter Bates. So do they want to know about Edwards or Bates?
I think Edwards.
Bates. Edwards. I don't know. Edwards was just an adventurer, an explorer, and he wrote this popular book about the Amazon, and he's not a person who did science.
And Bates, because
Henry Walter Bates, actually. So at some point, after a few few months, several months, almost a year together, Wallace and Bates separated, and people have speculated that this was trouble over a woman, and they fell out, and all kinds of problems. Actually, the practical reason is, if you're both out there to collect things and make money to fund further travels, it makes much more sense for you to go in two different places. So Wallace went up the Valpais and then Rio Negro, and Bates continued up the Amazon up to where it becomes the Rio Solimões, and he spent many years in the Amazon collecting butterflies. He's very famous for his name lives on in Batesian mimicry, which is the mimicry of palatable butterflies of unpalatable butterflies, which makes them not susceptible to predation. So that's called Batesian mimicry, and Henry Walter Bates is the person who kind of articulated that.
Just to finish off with one of Jeb's question. Hello, Jeb. Did Bates also send off plant specimens?
No, Bates never had any plants. No,
Okay.
Bates never collected any plants, and all of Bates's collections and Bates's journals are held in the Natural History Museum, and those are also, I think, a lot of Bates's collections are digitized, but his journals, I think, have also been digitized.
Okay, thank you so much, Sandy. I'm sorry, everyone.
You.
I'm going to have to stop the questions here. That was amazing. Thank you, Sandy. I thought it would be, and you always deliver. It's wonderful to have you.
Well, thank you for having me, and I love talking about Alfred Russel Wallace. And I just want to say, I think it's 200th birthday. I did a bit of in Usk. We had a wonderful day planting trees and talking about Wallace and thinking about Wallace and his interactions with all kinds of different sorts of people. And so it's the longest birthday party for anybody that I've ever known, which is as it should be when you're 200 years old.
Fitting, very fitting. Thank you. I just want to end with a little plug for our Book of Treasures, which also contains 2 pages written by George Beccaloni and Jim Costa, I think, on Wallace. So if you're interested in our collections, please go to our website, and this is on sale on our website for £12. And thank you so much, Sandy, and please do join us for the next Linnean Lens, which will be on the 14th of March and also on Wallace, but this time Wallace in the Malay Archipelago. Thank you so much. Have a good day, everyone. Bye-bye.